Hi, welcome to FraeLea Conversations. I'm FraeLea, and this is Frank. So, in a previous episode, we were talking about our brand, Genuine Modern Fantasy. But what exactly is fantasy? It's the question we're going to answer today. Okay. Right, Frank?
I guess, yes, we are.
Will you tell us about it?
Yeah, it didn't sound like you were reading that or anything. That's all right.
Cool.
So it's, sci-fi and fantasy often get lumped together. And it's interesting because they are both different genres, but they often get lumped together. And when you do lump them together, they end up being the third biggest selling genre in the industry behind romance and thrillers. So that's good and bad in that respect. And the way I always think about it is sci-fi, it ends up focusing more on technology, like why are things the way they are? How does it work? You know, how's the technology behind it work? You know, whether it's robots, AI, you know, anything like that. Whereas fantasy is magic. You know, fantasy kind of glosses over how things work oftentimes and just the fact that it does. So there is bleed over sometimes, like Star Wars has elements of both. They're a great example of kind of space fantasy, but everyone kind of says, okay, it's in space, so therefore it's sci-fi. But we're not going to go into, I think, sci-fi so much right now because we write fantasy, and we're going to kind of talk about the subgenres today.
Please.
So I guess I'd probably start with the biggest one and the one that we're writing in, which is urban fantasy, or as we like to call it, modern fantasy, as our slogan says.
Right.
And urban fantasy, as it's more popularly known, is basically fantasy that happens in the modern era that is generally tends to be in modern cities or modern settings. So you have your wizards or your vampires or whatever it is that you have in a modern setting. So everything's modern except for the fact there's magic in there. So that's because we write in North Dakota as our setting. That's why we prefer to call it modern fantasy, because North Dakota is a pretty rural state. It's not an urban state. So that would be urban fantasy or modern fantasy. Probably the second biggest, or one of the next biggest ones, would be epic fantasy. And the most popular would be Lord of the Rings, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit. He's kind of the godfather of epic fantasy, and he's the one that you kind of think of. He's ubiquitous with it. And epic fantasy is when they have an entire world created, a fictional world where the stories take place. And often, there's definitely magic involved. There's often more of a medieval flair to it with swords and that type of weapon. Dragons are popular, obviously. And another, I guess, more modern example would be George R.R. Martin with Game of Thrones, or as his book series is called, Song of Ice and Fire. And but it's more popularly known as Game of Thrones. So that's an obvious one. That's epic fantasy. Another big one would be paranormal romance, which is kind of a hybrid between the most popular genre, which is romance, and fantasy. And we don't write that, but you do read a lot of that too, where you have vampires and werewolves and the other kinds of supernatural phenomena, but with a romantic flair, with the love story being kind of the central focus. Another, I guess there's several other ones, but I guess to touch briefly, like portal fantasy is another one, and that probably a classic example of that would be Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis.
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz is a fantastic example too, and there's other examples like that too, but it's where you start out in kind of a modern, non-magical world, and then you're transported through a portal, if you will, into this magic world. And that's where those are good examples, I guess, of portal fantasy. And I kind of bring that up because we're planning on writing some of that as well eventually. That's going to be kind of a spin-off series to what we're currently writing, but that's down the road. And there's other ones like historical fantasy, which would be kind of like the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur, that type of thing. And there's a bunch of other ones. But that's kind of the big fantasy subgenres, and I guess that's kind of an overview right there.
Oh, well, that was a pretty good overview.
Well, thank you. We know what we're talking about a little bit.
A little bit. All right, so what is your favorite genre of fiction? What do you like to read, and why? Well, we would love to hear from you at frhurt.com. Thanks for watching.